Okay. So hello and welcome everyone. We're all here tonight because we care about the well-being of children. Hopefully most of you are parents, although I think some of you may be school employees. Mental health is a complicated topic and I could spend a long time discussing it. So I'm only going to be touching on the really high points and the things that are most important during this presentation, but we should have plenty of time afterwards if you want to stay on for questions or comments. I will also be monitoring the chat. So feel free to type anything in there or unmute yourself if you have any questions to ask at all. So this is one of my favorite mental health quotes. Abraham Maslow, he's well known in the mental health field because he created Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is the theory that people need their basic needs filled first: food, water, warmth, rest, safety, before we can begin fulfilling other needs such as belonging and our mental health. And so what I believe this quote's saying is that for our mental health to thrive, we can't just maintain the status quo. It's something we always have to be working on, even in those moments where things just feel okay. We can't just stop working on it because we feel okay in the moment. And we don't want our children's mental health to just be okay. We want them to be able to thrive and keep working on it. Because when we're working toward that place of thriving, when something happens, it's much easier for them to bounce back. So my goal for today is to give you the information and tools you need to be able to identify when you have a child that's struggling and how to help. So we're going to briefly be talking about some statistics, some things that can protect or put your child at risk, and some signs and symptoms that could mean your child is struggling, and lastly, what you can actually do about it. So specifically, we'll be talking about changes you can make in your home and some resources that are available from outside of the home. And even though we'll be spending our time today talking primarily about how to identify poor mental health and what to do when that's happening, it's also important to mention that mental health is so much more than when we're struggling. It's something we all have, and it's something we work on every single day. One of the biggest battles we fight when we're talking about mental health is just the stigma and shame that surrounds it. So part of normalizing the conversation is talking about it in a sense that, it's something we all have. It has its good days, it has its bad days. Mental health is when we've had a stressful day, so we decide to take a bubble bath or go for a walk because those things make you feel better. That's mental health. When you lose someone close to you and you grieve their loss, that's mental health too. And even when everything's going well, that's mental health as well. And whether or not we're mentally healthy depends actually a lot on how we're feeling about our own life circumstances. And this is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about our children as well. I'm sure there are some among us who our kids have come up to us and been like, this thing is stressing me out, or I'm so overwhelmed, and you just don't get it. You don't understand why they're stressed out. And maybe you've said to them, oh, you've got nothing to worry about. Like, this is not a big deal. It's important to respect what they're feeling, or respect not only our children, but when someone says they're struggling with their mental health, respect the fact that they say they're struggling. And don't try to argue with them and, say, oh, it's not that bad. You have to respect their feelings, even if you don't agree with the reasoning behind them. And a great definition of mental health actually comes from the World Health Organization. And they say that someone's mentally healthy when they achieve a state of well-being where someone realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and are able to make contributions to their community. This is something, like I said previously, we always need to be working toward that thriving. We always need to be working toward that. And most people will struggle with their mental health at some point in their lifetime. In fact, around half of us will have a diagnosable mental, or can meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition at some point in our life. And that includes children. Children fall in that category. And so that includes things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and they are definitely less common diagnoses and more common diagnoses. But that 50% number, it doesn't include just, it doesn't include the number of people that are going to struggle with their mental health at some point, which is all of us. And we will all have problems in our life that challenge our ability to be happy and confident. And I think it'd be fair to say probably today, there's been something that has challenged your feelings of happiness and confidence. And so how we address these challenges show the strength of our mental health. Our mental health isn't an on-off switch. There are different degrees of mental health and health. And even those that have mental health conditions can be mentally healthy, especially if they're getting the necessary help and learning how to address symptoms in healthy ways. Always think of person first. Someone is a person before their diagnosis. And like I said, mental health conditions are very common. 1 in 5 experience one every year, and the difference between that 50% and 1 in 5 is that some mental health conditions do eventually go away. Some are lifelong conditions. And these statistics not only apply to adults, but our children. And the severity of mental health conditions, they vary from person to person, but most fall into mild to moderate expression of symptoms, with only about 5% of the population having what's known as serious mental illnesses, which are mental, behavioral, or emotional disorders that result in serious functional impairment that substantially interfere with or limit one or more major life activities. A couple diagnoses that most often would fall into this category are schizophrenia or other types of psychosis, or oftentimes bipolar disorder. And the mental health needs of our young people have unfortunately been increasing over the years. Rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are up. You have to be living in a bubble to not have read those reports or really just seen what's happening around us. And there are different reasons why people say the rates are up. I was talking to a teacher just today who said, it's the social media. The social media is doing it. But I really don't want us to focus on the why, because ultimately the why doesn't matter, because we can't do anything about social media. So instead, we need to focus on the fact that we have a large percentage of our kids who are struggling. Now let's do something about it. But we also have to get a firm grasp on what our kids are actually dealing with. And a great place to get an idea of that is by looking at data. And one of my favorite things is called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's something they do at the local and state level. For high school students and middle school students, it's done, or it's supposed to be done every other year. And they assess all the reasons that could lead to a child's premature death. So this not only includes behaviors like wearing your seatbelt, but it includes getting information about mental health needs as well. So what we know based on the most recent available data from this survey is that in every classroom of 30 students, there are 10 to 11 who meet the clinical symptoms of depression or another mental health condition in the year, 5 to 6 who have contemplated suicide, 4 to 5 students who have planned their suicide, and 3 to 4 who have attempted suicide. So you never want to think, not my kid, because thinking like that can prevent us from being able to recognize when our child is struggling. And mental health issues affect kids of all ages. Half of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14, and 75% will develop by age 24. So during that pivotal time of brain development. And as you can see, based on my PowerPoint, the average age of onset varies based on the type of diagnosis. So anxiety disorders are actually the most common mental health condition, affecting 32% of our youth. And the average age of onset is 6 years old. And then moving up, we've got behavior disorders, which includes things like oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. Then we have mood disorders, and that includes depression and bipolar disorder. The average age of onset for those is 13 years old, and then substance use disorders, which we see a little bit later. So mental health is something that needs our attention at every age. And another thing that's getting our attention right now is how the pandemic is affecting our community's mental health. So we know at this point it is affecting our mental health in one way or another. Maybe it's, there have been a lot of negative things that have come along with the pandemic, not only instability of routine, but for a lot of people, loss of jobs or income, isolation, which has been especially a big deal for our kids that are learning virtually. But also along with that, there's fear. There's fear of illness. There's fear of getting sick yourself. There's fear of losing someone you care about. And then a lot of people have lost someone close to them. And so they're going through that grieving process as well. And these mental strains can be seen actually looking at some of the statistics that are available. So in Tennessee, there's this great system that's known as Essence. And this system captures visits to emergency departments by youth and sends alerts for the weeks where counties are experiencing higher than average numbers of youth coming into emergency departments for suicide-related reasons. So this includes suicide attempts, intentional self-harm, or suicidal thoughts and feelings. It doesn't include suicide deaths. So in 2020, of the 95 counties in Tennessee, 78 received an Essence alert. So 78 of those counties had higher than average weeks of those visits to the emergency rooms, for a total of 219 alerts statewide. So Davidson County, which is where Nashville is, had the highest number of alerts, and Southeast Tennessee had the highest number of alerts for the non-metro region. But Knox County had 16 weeks where our visits to emergency departments were higher for our youth, which is it's sad thinking about. And when we look at mobile crisis, there's been a notable increase as well, with an increase of 1,500 calls for 2020 for our area. And while there's no evidence that suicide deaths are increasing, we won't actually have this information for a couple years. But it's also important when we look at any of this information that we try not to make any assumptions. There could be reasons behind the increase that are actually good. It could be that we're spending more time with our kids so that we are actually recognizing when they're struggling, and then we're intervening. So we can't say for sure what is causing an increase. We just know there's an increase for this year. And it's also important to look at things that put our children at risk or things that protect them, because once we know the things they've experienced, then we can be preemptive about different interventions such as therapy. You never want to wait until a crisis to actually do something. So mental health conditions are at their root medical conditions that live in the brain, and how well our brain functions depends on two primary functions: our genetics and the environment that surrounds us. When we're looking at risk factors, I would encourage all of you to be hypercritical about the type of caregiver that you are. Definitely don't beat yourself up, but be aware of your own strengths and your weaknesses as a caregiver. Be aware of the own mental health issues that you faced and the type of traumas that you've experienced and how those could be affecting your children in negative ways. And no one likes to admit our own faults and shortcomings, but when we do, we have a good foundation of knowledge to best know the issues our child may be facing. It does no one any good to be in denial. So first and foremost, if you or a relative has a mental health condition, maybe it's something you've dealt with in the past or you're currently dealing with it, that increases your child's risk. For example, in my family, my father has bipolar disorder, which I actually didn't find out until a couple of years ago, but I've had my own struggles with depression and anxiety, as has my sister. Had we had that information, we might have been more preemptive in seeking out mental health treatment for ourselves earlier. And then certain life situations known as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, can increase your child's risk. And we know the more of ACEs that our children have, the higher risk they are of not only having mental health issues, but it increases their suicide risk and decreases their overall life expectancy. So ACEs include events such as abuse, which includes physical emotional and sexual abuse, neglect, and includes also other household dysfunctions such as domestic violence, if a relative has been incarcerated, divorce, or substance abuse. And trauma can also, and while outside trauma isn't necessarily included in ACEs, it can definitely have an impact on our child. And it can include things like natural disasters and bullying. Both of those things can also affect kids. And trauma triggers our child's brain's stress response. And it basically makes the brain hyper aware, and it keeps pummeling the brain with these chemicals. And those chemicals can lead our child to form unhealthy, disruptive, or addictive behaviors as a way of coping. And childhood is such a critical time for brain development, and the brain is very plastic during childhood. But when they form those unhealthy habits, it can create a rocky, very rocky foundation for development, which is why it's important to intervene while the brain is still plastic. And it can be disheartening to look at risk factors. We wonder if there's anything we can do to protect our children. I think, like I said, it's important to not beat ourselves up, because there are definitely situations that we can't control. One of the situations I look at as a key example is domestic violence. People that have never been in a domestic violence situation say, just leave, just leave. And it's not as easy as that. And of course, during that entire situation, the child is being exposed, the partner who's being abused is exposed. It's just a whole mess of trauma. And hopefully, if that's something you've dealt with, you're out now. Please don't beat yourself up if that was a situation you're in, because we don't have control over every situation in our life. And it is important to be aware of our own abilities as parents, our own history, but to work on them to improve our child's safety. Because the traumas you've experienced can make it harder to be the type of parent you want to be. And like I said, there are times when we can't remove our child's exposure to trauma, but what we can do is build up their resilience. And resilience is someone's capability to withstand future stress and catastrophe. So if you look at your child's mental health like a foundation, the traumas someone experiences put cracks in their foundation. But resilience is like adding extra supports, concrete, adding beams. It doesn't fix the cracks, right? But it does mean that the foundation is not going to come tumbling down. So some things that can help build your child's resilience are having close and healthy relationships with friends and families. And any of these things, I will say, that are on this list, a lot of them you can't personally build for your child, but you can model healthy behaviors. Modeling healthy behaviors goes a really long way with children. But you can also work on your own relationship with your child to be more open and caring. Having a positive view of self, which you can't do for them, but you can make sure they feel loved and give them compliments. Give yourself compliments. Model that behavior. The ability to manage strong feelings and impulses. Having good problem-solving skills. Having good communication. If someone feels in control of the situation, they're more resilient. And then lastly, if someone's able to find positive meaning despite their traumatic circumstances, that can help them be more resilient. If you have a child in middle or high school, it's incredibly likely that if your child has a mental health condition, they likely have already begun exhibiting symptoms. Symptoms of mental health conditions, they're not occasional things. They are not the same as growing pains and teen angst, and I'll get into how you can tell the difference. But if your child has a persistent, long-lasting change that is causing problems in every part of their life, then it's likely a mental health condition, and there are things you can do to address it. So some things to be on the lookout for are changes in eating habits, and that could be eating either too much or too little. Also pay attention if your child starts to obsess about eating healthy. Just because someone is getting healthy and losing weight doesn't mean the reason behind it is. Sleep disturbances can also include sleeping too much or too little, not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep, or if your child has started having new or persistent nightmares. Maybe they're getting or they seem more fatigued or tired, even if they're getting a full night of sleep. Or they may be even reporting aches and pains, and that can include headaches, migraines, stomach pain, especially for those that struggle with anxiety. Stomach pain is a really common complaint. And other physical symptoms without the presence of a physical illness. And physical complaints related to mental health tend to be more vague. I always think of the typical excuse that I gave when I was in middle school when I didn't want to go to gym. I'd be like, my stomach hurts. But the reality, and my stomach did hurt, but the reality was I was anxious about performing in sports because I was always a very physically awkward child. And there are also emotional and other behavioral signs to be on the lookout for. So if your child becomes more aggressive, stubborn, hostile, or even prone to outbursts, also pay attention to grades. A sudden shift up or down can indicate a change in their mental status. And people always wonder about the shift up of why would that be a sign of problem? If your child has always been a B, C student, and now they're passing and getting A pluses in every single one of their classes, something has changed to make them be that way. And so think about what's going on in their life. Maybe they had a tutor. So that's a possible reason for that increase in grades. But if no other changes have been happening, and there's been a sudden increase in grades, it could mean they're obsessing over their grades, studying really hard, and it's affecting their ability to perform in other parts of their life. If your child loses interest in activities, maybe it's not something they completely stop doing, but maybe they just don't seem happy doing it anymore. And with that, you also want to look for external influences. So let's say your child has entered into a relationship with someone, and so they don't want to go to basketball practice because they're spending time with their girlfriend. Well, that's a possible explanation. That wouldn't be a mental health condition. But it could be a mental health condition. Continuing down the list of symptoms is if your child shows difficulty concentrating or focusing, if they start avoiding certain places or people, or just avoiding people in general. And this is not a child who's shy. This is someone who has had a change in their behavior. They may even have regression to behaviors present at a younger age. For example, if your child starts wetting the bed again, or even sucking their thumb. There may also be changes in their physical appearance. For example, if they stop showering or bathing themselves, or even groom themselves more. Changes in appearance can also include a change in the type of clothing that they wear. So pay attention to what parts of their body they always keep covered, as it can indicate self-harming behaviors such as cutting. And I don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of self-harm, but I will let you know, more often than not, children are not self-harming on their wrists and arms. They are self-harming on their body and parts of their bodies that can be easily covered and hidden, because they recognize it as a shameful behavior that should be hidden. So they're more often making sure their stomachs are covered, the tops of their shoulders, and their thighs, because those are parts of their bodies that can be hidden without suspicion. So always pay attention to that as well. If there's new or more intense use of a substance to cope, I cannot tell you how many middle school students I have met that have an intense caffeine addiction, and that is a problem. Nicotine and other substances, even those that have been prescribed by a doctor, can be abused. Other risk-taking behaviors, if they start isolating themselves more, if they have seemed to be more restless, if they have new or recurrent fears, if they seem to be sad all the time, they start having panic attacks, if you're noticing those self-harming behaviors. And like I said, you won't always be able to see the physical signs, but let's say some razors start going missing from your home, or your child starts spending more time in their room with the door closed. My sister was a chronic self-harmer, and looking back, because I didn't recognize it at the time, that was a big indication that something was going on. She started spending more and more time in her room with the door closed. And lastly, if your child starts talking about death or dying or making big or direct suicide threats, then you need to intervene as soon as possible. So maybe looking over those symptoms, you're thinking, this is my kid, you know, but you're wondering, is it those growing pains? Is it teen angst, or is it a mental health condition? Well, there are 3 points that you can pay attention to that will help you figure out if it's a potential mental health concern. Start by looking at intensity. How intense are the symptoms? Do they come and go, or are they more persistent? Mental health conditions, like I said, they're more persistent. The teen angst may be the more coming and going. Are they mild but chronic? Because if they're chronic, then it could be a mental health condition. Are they so disruptive that your child doesn't want to get out of bed? Are they engaging in self-harm or suicidal thoughts? All of those things could indicate a sign of a mental health condition. Second, duration. Does the moodiness come and go? That's probably just growing pains. Is it gone moments later? Is it followed by days of calm and normalcy? That's probably just teen angst. But if the moodiness is more chronic, lasts for longer periods of time without breaks, there's something bigger happening. And lastly, domains. Mental health conditions affect someone across every domain of their life, their social, home, and school or professional life. Mental health conditions are pervasive, so they won't just be present at home or school, it's going to be present in their social life as well. When it's just teen angst or growing pains, they can likely pull that behavior, that disruptive behavior together when they're in their social circle. So now we're going to get into the intervention. What can we actually do about it? First and foremost, if you notice any of these signs, the sooner you can get your child help, the better. Ultimately, you can make the healthcare decisions for them. As really in the state of Tennessee, under the age of 16 is when that cutoff is, and I'll explain in a little bit why that is. But the outcome is likely going to be much better if your child is a willing participant. I never recommend forcing your child to receive psychiatric treatment without their consent unless you've exhausted all other options first. So the best intervention for children that are struggling is actively engaging in prevention efforts before they start struggling. And we'll talk about what to do if you started noticing these signs as well. So things you can do to create a more welcoming environment in your home for conversations about mental health are, first and foremost, model sharing about your emotions and challenges positively. Show your child that it's okay to talk about our feelings. A lot of times as parents, we feel like we have to maintain, and it's important to maintain boundaries, not only for our health, but for our child's health. But this is one of those areas where when we're silent about our emotions and feelings, we can't ultimately be 100% transparent. We can't really hide what we're thinking and feeling. Our children will pick up on that regardless. So when we talk about them in healthy ways, and our children are able to observe that and take on some of those behaviors themselves. Second, if you struggle with a mental health condition, or you have in the past, maybe you take medication, or maybe even you do yoga or take baths to calm down, talk about those things. Like I said, your child has probably noticed it anyway. And when you're silent, that sends a much stronger message that mental health is something to be secretive about, that it's something to be afraid of. Also ask questions when nothing's wrong. Ask your child questions every single day, and use open-ended questions that are specific. I mean, all of us have probably asked our kid, how was your day? and the answer is fine or okay, or maybe you do have a talkative kid and they talk on and on and on about how their day was. That's great. But you can set yourself up for success instead by asking questions like, what was your favorite part of your day? Or what was difficult for you today? Also be open and honest with how you're feeling, because it'll make them more likely to open up. This means being willing to be vulnerable, self-deprecating, or even prideful about something that you accomplished during the day. And there are things that you can also integrate into your daily family life that are good for everyone's mental health in the home. First and foremost, don't underestimate the importance of taking care of your physical health. So that includes having a good night's sleep, having a healthy diet as possible, and getting regular exercise. And that's something you can do together. Making these a priority for your family can immediately improve your family's mental health and well-being. And create a consistent routine. This could look like having an afternoon schedule of sports practice or another extracurricular activity, dinner, homework, and then some free time to decompress before heading to bed. And it can also include having a set bedtime every night. And especially for those that struggle with their mental health, having a routine is extremely comforting because you know what's coming up. Also work to create a sense of belonging in your family. Remind your child that they're important members of your family and be sure to point out positive things about them. Those go a really long way with kids. Compliment them for their unique attributes that aren't typically noticed. So maybe compliment them for their creativity, their thought process over a topic, or even a small gesture they did for their sibling that you wouldn't usually acknowledge. And lastly, be sure to plan intentional time together. Spending time with your children without the distraction of screens or other responsibilities can help you build that space where you have that trust. And then you can notice when they start exhibiting those signs of change. And try to work also on those points of resilience. So that is something, like I said, you probably need to start in your own life as well. So be open with your own grief and frustration. Let your child know it's normal and healthy to experience a range of emotions, because if they feel like they can relate to you, then they may be more open to talking with you about their struggles. It's the reason that my sister, with her history of self-harm, has a much closer relationship with my father, who has also struggled with his mental health in that way, because they have that point of connection. And then getting into the pandemic, while it does seem like we're coming out of the tail ends of things, it seems like there's a lot more hope and things are getting better. There still has come along with the pandemic a lot of loneliness and isolation. And I think that's where a lot of the mental health struggles associated with the pandemic have been coming from. And loneliness was certainly an issue before the pandemic, but it seems to be an even bigger issue now, especially for kids who are learning virtually. And loneliness, the answer to loneliness is not a one size fits all, because loneliness is such a personal experience. There are kids that are learning in the classroom and they still feel lonely. They have the same routines, but they still feel lonely. And when a child has that kind of persistent loneliness, it's important to also recognize that they may be dealing with more than just loneliness. It could be something bigger, like depression or another mental health condition. Because loneliness at its root means you aren't getting meaningful social connection. But there are a few things we can do to address feelings of loneliness with our kids that are physically isolated right now. Some of these you may be able to facilitate, but may also require you to work with your child's teacher. And don't be afraid to talk these things through with your child's teacher. I can guarantee you teachers right now are just as concerned about their students' mental health, but it's something they probably need a little bit of extra support and help with. So first and foremost, try to have your child get peer interaction outside of the virtual learning space. And it's important that the behavior is not monitored by adults. Children really need that environment where they can talk openly and honestly to their peers. And if possible, they should be able to see each other when that's happening. I've seen some schools even enact school-wide programs to link kids with others they wouldn't typically interact with to help form some of those social relationships. Also, try to find ways for kids to connect despite the difference. Something that my team has been doing, because we've all been working virtually, is every week we go into our team's chat thread and we share a prompt. This week it was 2 lies and a truth. And two truths and a lie. And we try to figure out what is the lie. It helps us connect more. But some other prompts that we've had are, what was your favorite children's book? Or if you could only listen to one album, what would it be? And it's a good informal way for us to feel connected with each other, even though we're physically separated. Phone calls and letter writing are also great options, especially for kids that are suffering from the Zoom fatigue we've all been hearing so much about. And lastly, and this is one of my favorite ways to address loneliness, is by focusing on giving your energy to someone else who needs it. So by volunteering your time, and there are always nonprofits that are looking for volunteers, even during this time when a lot of those rules and regulations have changed. It's not as easy as it once was, but there is still people looking for volunteers. The one I always like to personally plug are working with animal shelters, especially this time of year. There are always rescues and shelters that are looking for foster parents. It's a great way for your child to learn some responsibility and also give back their time to something that needs it. But building your home into a place that's more mentally healthy, friendly, it not only benefits our kids, but it benefits us. It's something we have to keep working on. So those are things you can do to prevent. But now we need to talk about intervention, because chances are that your child will deal with some type of mental distress in their lifetime. Remember that 50%, 1 in 2 in their lifetime. And our hope is that we've created the type of environment that our children feel comfortable talking to us about it when they start experiencing distress. But unfortunately, this doesn't always happen when our child is struggling. When you're struggling with your mental health, your mind can make you believe all kinds of things, even if they aren't true. So you may have this negative thought pop in your head that says, nothing you do is going to make this situation better, or that people aren't going to take you seriously, or that people would judge you because of it. And all these negative thoughts, these fears and assumptions lead people to mask or pretend like they're fine and close themselves off. And so sometimes this means you need to start the conversation yourself. But know that even if the conversation doesn't go well, even if you don't know the right words, just trying to have this conversation with your kid, it can make a difference. Sometimes they just need to know that they're seen, that you're recognizing that something is going on. They need to know they're not being ignored or overlooked. Talking to your children and developing that safe space is going to be very beneficial in the long run. And the words you use are very important. So choosing the wrong words can leave your child feeling stigmatized or shut down. But it is a hard battle to win, finding the right words. Even someone like me who does this professionally, when I personally have to have this conversation with people I care about, it's so much harder. And I make mistakes. But something you can control is the intention with which you approach the conversation. And if you approach it with the right intention, then the specific words you use are less important. So always make sure to start from a non-judgmental and caring place. Realize that even though you're your child's age once, you don't know what their experiences have been. Don't make any assumptions about how they're feeling, and then try to be hopeful for them. Because when someone is struggling with their mental health, you really struggle with the hope that it's going to get better. So it's your responsibility to hold the hope for them. Start with the little things to set the conversation up for success. So make sure you're not preoccupied with something else or multitasking. Be sure your child is getting all of your attention. That means maintaining eye contact and really listening to what your child says, not only their words, but their body language. So if they're physically closing off their body, that's something to be concerned about. If they start clenching their fists as you're talking, That will also give you an indication as to how the conversation is going. Start by telling your child that you've noticed some differences in their behavior. Always tie it to something concrete. Don't be vague when you're approaching the conversation, but also don't label the process and automatically bring up anxiety, depression, or another mental health condition. This can leave your child feeling labeled and confrontational because there is still so much stigma associated with struggling with your mental health. So a good conversation and a good opening line is, hey, I've noticed this, what's going on? Or like, hey, I noticed that you have been spending more time alone lately. What's going on? The words I always like to focus on is care and concern. I care about you and I'm concerned. And remember to ask those open-ended questions to get more than just a yes or no. Otherwise, they may just stay shut off. And recognize and respect the fact that the conversation may likely be uncomfortable for everyone that's at the table. There's a generational difference between our generation and the generation of our kids in our comfort level talking about mental health. And the conversations have become much more normalized in children and adolescents than they were for any one of us. So we have a hard time modeling and knowing the right words to say. But having these conversations can create a more welcoming environment. So don't try to expect an immediate connection when you're having these conversations. Even in the past, your child has been very open with you. Don't give up on the conversation. Sometimes you have to be persistent, and keep paying attention to your child, even if they say, hey, nothing is wrong. And it's absolutely okay if your child doesn't want to talk to you. Respect that decision too. But if they're not comfortable talking to you, ask if they'd prefer to talk to someone else. And this can open up the door to having your child willingly see a therapist or seeking some type of outside help. So there are some words and phrases that you do want to avoid using when having these conversations about mental health. Typically, young people experiencing mental illness or poor mental health feel like they're in a place where they're alone, doing something wrong, or in pain, can't figure out why. So try to avoid using punishing or patronizing phrases that can support the message that something is wrong with me. So a couple examples are, you're so smart. How did you let this happen to you? What did you do to get depressed? Those things you're saying it's their reason, their fault, they're feeling the way they are. Or saying things like, I understand, I was depressed one time. When most of the times people say that, they're saying, hey, I was sad once and I got over it. If you actually experience clinical depression, that's a way to connect, but don't use the 1 week you were sad as a way of connecting to your child who's clinically depressed. Saying things like calm down can be very unhelpful, especially for kids with anxiety. I promise you, if they could calm down, they would. Saying things like, oh, you finally got out of bed. In fact, it's a good idea to just always avoid using the word finally when you're having conversations, because it can come off as very patronizing. Instead, saying something like, hey, it's nice to see you woke up early today. Want to get some breakfast? Reward them for behaviors that you want to see. And also, don't say they're being dramatic or doing it for attention. Saying things like that can add fuel to the fire and make them feel more cut off, because all of those things serve to punish your child. Also, don't push your beliefs or assumptions onto them. Don't ever try to throw logic at or rationalize mental health struggles and tell them they shouldn't feel that way or things aren't that bad, because that can increase, again, those feelings that something is wrong with me. And we want to create a safe and open environment where they feel okay talking about these things. For a child struggling with their mental health, sometimes all they need are changes in their routine or home life. But then there are times when it can be really beneficial to get outside help for your child. And mental health needs exist on the spectrum, which is why everyone sort of has to find what works best for them. So children with mild symptoms may be able to manage them through healthy coping and self-care. That can include the things we've already talked about, like having a routine of self-care, getting a good night's sleep, exercising, having supportive relationships, or can it even include like mindfulness practice like journaling or meditation. A quick thing you can do for your child who's struggling is buying them a journal where that is a place where they can privately record their thoughts. Um, but when self-care doesn't alleviate symptoms, you should always take the steps needed to get your child the professional help they need. And I will say that with one caveat, if your child is self-harming or suicidal, don't ever start by trying to fix the problem on your own. First and foremost, remove all lethal means from your home. So that means securing medications, firearms, or knives. The Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, they have locks for medicine cabinets that they can give you. But if you don't have any concerns about suicide or self-harm, start by making an appointment with your child's pediatrician or their primary care doctor, because then the doctor can do an initial consultation and help you come up with best steps for your child. They'll also be able to assess for physical health conditions, which can mimic the symptoms of mental health conditions. For example, thyroid disorders and anemia both mimic depression. And the reason we want to assess those physical things first is because generally intervention for physical health conditions is a lot quicker than intervention for mental health conditions. But once your child's doctor has excluded a physical cause, the next step is usually talking to a counselor or therapist. When finding a counselor, it's important, try to involve your child in the process as much as possible because it can take away some of the fear about it. So you can have them do research on different options for therapy that they have. There are lots of different types of therapy someone can get, from CBT, DBT, all these different types of therapy. And in fact, most private practices will even make descriptions available on their website for all their therapists, give you a little information about them, the issues they are most comfortable with. And so your child and you can figure out who you think is going to be the best fit for them. And unlike other things in life, it's really important that someone be able to have some sort of a connection with their therapist. So it's also likely that your child's therapist will want to involve you in their treatment process. But remember, there's a certain level of confidentiality your child's counselor needs to have with them. They're not expected to disclose anything to you unless your child is threatening to harm themselves or others, so that you can make the appropriate changes in your home. There are a few other things to know about the therapy process. If you're nervous or uncomfortable about the idea of leaving your child alone in a room with someone you don't know for therapy, most therapists are okay with you taking the time to get to know them before they start working with your child. And while therapists, they won't tell you what's happening, they won't tell you what your child is talking to them about. They won't talk to you about the specifics. You're usually welcome to call them, shoot them an email, and try to get some feedback try to talk to them about what's happening in your home and ask for pointers on the best way to approach certain situations. Sometimes, and this is what I usually prefer, is parents and families are given space within the child's session to process what's going on, because the family is an important part of a child's recovery. And you should also be able to sit outside the room when your child is talking to the mental health professional, which can address some of those safety concerns. And finally, in the state of Tennessee, when it comes to behavioral health care, which is therapy and medication for psychological needs, youth at the age of 16 can consent to their own medical care. This is known as the mature minor exception. And it's a law that basically means at the age of 16 and up, your child does not need your approval to seek care, nor can you force them to receive treatment against their wishes. So they're treated as an adult in respect to their behavioral health care. And finally, Medication is also usually recommended for children and adolescents and can help address any symptoms quicker than therapy alone would. However, as with any medical decision, I highly encourage you to do the research on what is the best option for you and your family. Remember to advocate for yourself. Your child's therapist doesn't have all the power. At the end of the day, you get to make the decisions. And yes, you should probably listen to your therapist's guidance, but also recognize there are sometimes bad therapists out there. I don't want to dissuade you from getting your child therapist or having them take medication, because those bad therapists, I think they're few and far between. But it is also important to advocate for yourself if you feel like someone is taking advantage of you or telling you to do things that don't align with your value symptoms. And recovery from a mental health condition, I will say, is not one and done. It's an ongoing process. Don't pressure your child to be normal. Rather, learn to accept and appreciate their new normal, because even though mental health conditions can be debilitating, they don't have to be. And how you react to and support your child can make a huge difference in their long-term success. Recovery is not simple or straightforward. Please don't expect your child to improve immediately, and don't give up if there aren't any changes. Treatment's a very individual process, and it's important to use all the tools you have at your disposal until you find the one that's a right fit for your child. And so to finish up today, I wanted to give you a few more resources that you can access to learn more about mental health. My personal favorite resource I always go to and recommend time and time again is called the Child Mind Institute. They have some great resources on their website. And you're always welcome to get in touch with me, and I can provide information, resources, support. Please don't be afraid to get in touch with me. And these are some great outpatient resources. So basically, this is therapy. There are two types: inpatient, where it is a more like a hospitalized setting, and then there's outpatient, where you come and go. So I personally work with people at all of these organizations. So if you have any issues getting appointments or accessing services, let me know and I can help bridge the gap. Like I said, mental health treatment the system isn't perfect. Sometimes it is helpful to know someone. And the last thing I want to talk about today is crisis. So if the situation is a crisis, and what I mean when I say that is if your child is currently harming themselves or others, specifically related to suicide, I would recommend first calling mobile crisis, even if you're not sure what the right course of action is. I work very closely with the mobile crisis coordinator that covers Knox County through Helen Ross McNabb. And she has told me, if you have any questions about whether or not things are a crisis or the right thing to do, you can call the mobile crisis number. And a trained clinician will then talk to you or do an assessment to determine the best course of action for your child. But I will say that with one caveat: mobile crisis generally won't respond if your child needs immediate medical attention. So if they have any physical injuries that need care before mental health treatment, they'll recommend you either seek medical care or call 911. Or if there is a situation where your child needs to detox, or if there's any other like overdose type situation, they'll recommend you access medical services first. And then lastly, here on the screen is the Knox County non-emergency number. This is likely something you won't have to use within your own home, but it can be really helpful if you're concerned about a neighbor or a friend. And officers can do what are known as safety checks, where they go to someone's home and basically just make sure they're safe. And whenever possible, when working with law enforcement, see if they can provide what are known as CIT officers. They're crisis intervention trained officers. And so they've received, I believe, 40 hours of mental health training so they can better intervene during times of mental health crisis. So I will send you all a survey and a resource guide with some more information. But thank you guys for joining me tonight. And does anyone have any questions?